The war in Ukraine is no longer just a military challenge for Vladimir Putin, but also a political time bomb. Because while Russian forces continue to take heavy losses on the battlefield, they are achieving fewer and fewer meaningful gains, and in some areas they are even being pushed back. And at the same time, something even more dangerous is happening far away from the front lines. Because inside Russia itself, the pressure is building. The economy of the Russian Federation is weakening, debt is rising, inflation is eating into everyday's life, and even in major cities like Moscow or St. Petersburg, businesses are shutting down. And the effects of the war are no longer distant, they are becoming visible in daily life. And history shows us something very important for today. Regimes rarely fall because of military defeat alone. They normally fall when internal pressure reaches a breaking point. So the real question in the war in Ukraine is no longer whether Russia can win this war. The real question today is what happens if it doesn't. Because if we look closely at the Kremlin's recent actions, they don't look like preparations for eternal victory. Instead, they look like the preparation for a military and economic defeat. But let's talk about it today. Hi, my name is Alexander Kortan. I'm a strategic analyst and media manager from Austria, and I'm also the founder of the German YouTube channel Geopol. And today we want to take a closer look about the internal affairs inside the Kremlin and inside Vladimir Putin's circle of power. Because Russia always tells us that everything is going according to plan and that the victory in the special military operation is just a matter of time. But reality inside Moscow is starting to contradict that narrative. Because after more than 4 years of war, the Russian army still struggles to achieve decisive breakthroughs on the front line, and in fact recent developments suggest the opposite, because Ukrainian forces have not only stabilized key fronts, but also have regained territory in several regions, especially in the south in the Oblast Dnipropetrovsk. And according to statements from Ukrainian leadership and President Volodymyr Zelensky during a recent visit to London, Ukrainian troops managed to retake more land in the past month than Russia was able to capture. The Ukrainian counteroffensive for sure doesn't mean Ukraine is winning outright, but it clearly shows that Russia is far from achieving a decisive victory on the battlefield. And while the battlefield situation is difficult, the economic situation inside Russia may be even more concerning for the Kremlin and for Vladimir Putin. Because Russia's state finance is under increasing strain and entire sectors are struggling and more private businesses are being forced to shut down. And even figures and propagandists who strongly support the government have started to acknowledge these problems publicly, for example propagandist Vladimir Solovyov. Because he also reports of empty apartment blocks inside Moscow, declining consumer spending and rising financial pressure on ordinary citizens. And Solovyov also criticizes that more and more businesses inside Moscow have to shut down. And exactly this is where things inside Russia became politically dangerous. Because economic decline doesn't just weaken a country, it fuels dissatisfaction. And dissatisfaction, if it spreads far enough, can turn into instability. And for now, this doesn't mean that a revolution inside the Russian Federation is imminent, but history teaches us that systems like this often appear stable until suddenly they aren't. And we've already seen a glimpse of that fragility in the year of 2023. Because in June 2023, the Wagner uprising led by Yevgeny Prigozhin exposed just how vulnerable the system can be. And when Wagner forces took control of the city Rostov, there was no massive resistance from the population, and in fact many civilians even appeared supportive. And even more striking was the lack of immediate resistance from parts of the security apparatus, because the police and also the Russian army did nothing to stop Wagner. So for the Kremlin, the Wagner uprising made one thing crystal clear. The power is not unchallenged inside the Russian Federation, and a small escalation could be enough to overthrow the whole system. And when we look about dictatorships and regimes just like inside the Russian Federations, there's always one thing crystal clear. Once the perception of an unchallenged leadership cracks, things can change very quickly. And we have to be clear, since the Wagner uprising, the situation has not improved for the Russian population, because the war has continued, losses have mounted, and economic pressure has increased even more. And it seems that the Kremlin has drawn its own conclusions from this. Because what we are seeing now inside Moscow is a shift in priorities. And the focus inside the Kremlin is no longer purely on winning the war. Instead, it is increasingly on maintaining control in case of a catastrophe. And nowhere is this more visible than into Russia's approach to communication and information. Because over the past months, the Kremlin has significantly tightened its grip on the digital space, and one of the most notable examples is the restriction of the messenger Telegram, which has long been one of the most widely used communication systems inside Russia. And the shutdown of Telegram is not just a civilian issue, because Telegram has also played a crucial role inside the Russian military communication, especially among soldiers on the front lines in Ukraine. And recent disruptions have caused widespread technical issues across multiple regions, and users reported delays, outages and limited functionality. But Russia didn't care about its own troops and their communication inside Ukraine. They already shut down Telegram or made it so unstable that it cannot be used effectively. And we saw that in the Russian cities like Moscow or St. Petersburg, and we saw that there are civilians unhappy with the situation. But also on the front line, soldiers are complaining about the shutdown of Telegram. But now there is of course one decisive question. Why is the Kremlin ready to take such high risks when it's knowing that there are many disadvantages for the civilian population and also the Russian army? And the answer to this question lies in control. Because Telegram has been difficult or almost impossible for Russian authorities to fully monitor, largely due to encryption and refusal to hand over certain data to the government, and for a system that increasingly relies on surveillance and information control, this is a major problem. So instead of using Telegram, the state has been pushing its own alternative, a government-linked messaging platform named Max. But this Russian replacement comes with serious drawbacks. Because reports suggest that it is unreliable, lacks proper security features and is not trusted by many users, including within the military. And in fact, some military sources indicate that its use has been even restricted in combat zones due to security concerns. But despite all these problems, the Kremlin continues to promote it. And this tells us something very important. Because efficiency is no longer the top priority inside the Russian Federation. Control is. And this becomes even more clearer when we look at the broader internet restrictions in Moscow. Because in Moscow, authorities have begun implementing a system that effectively limits access to only approved websites. So we speak about kind of a digital whitelist. And the result in the last few days has been a widespread disruption of the communication sector inside Moscow. And in some cases, communication systems have partially collapsed entirely, and there have been reports of difficulties even reaching emergency services during outages. And from a purely strategic perspective, these measures seem counterproductive for Vladimir Putin, because they weaken economic activity, they disrupt daily life and even create problems for state institutions. So why is Vladimir Putin implementing them? And the answer is quite simple, because they serve a different purpose. Because these systems are not designed to strengthen the country in the short term. These measures are designed to secure the regime in a worst-case scenario. So if large-scale protests were to emerge, controlling communication would be critical, and limiting the ability of people to coordinate, share information or organize quickly can significantly reduce the effectiveness of such movements. And we've already seen similar strategies in other countries, just like Iran, where internet shutdowns played a key role in suppressing unrest. And this is exactly what makes the current situation inside Russia so revealing. Because the actions of Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin are not signs of trust and belief in total victory. Far more, they are actions of a government preparing for instability. Because the shutdown of the internet inside Moscow and other Russian cities is not a symbol of strength, it is a clear symbol of weakness. Because the Russian leadership today knows that its regime is very unstable, and in the coming months and years the regime could face a critical collapse. And the regime is preparing exactly for this scenario and not for a great victory inside Ukraine. But now, of course, I want to hear your thoughts about the internet shortages inside the Russian Federation. What do you think? How will this situation play out in the long term? Let me know in the comments. I will enjoy reading them. Otherwise, if you found this video helpful and informative, please do make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel Geopol Global. And otherwise, I will end the video here. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.